The hive never sleeps. It breathes in industrial sighs, exhales promethium fumes, and hums with the pulse of billions who no longer remember sunlight. Beneath its mountain of steel and ash, men are born nameless, work until their bones hum with machine rhythm, and die as ash offerings to the same engines they once fed. But lately, the hum has changed. A strange rhythm now coils through the vents, uneven, fevered, like the heart of something dying or awakening. The Vox systems whisper words that should not exist. Prayers warp into static. Lights flicker in cathedral manufactoria, where saints are cast in molten bronze and servitors bleed without being cut. Somewhere in the endless black, a siren wails for no reason, and no one dares ask why. For when a hive city begins to dream, it dreams in madness, and madness in the Imperium is never without purpose. So, listen closely, for what you are about to hear is not a tale of war, but of infection, not of flesh, but of faith. The kind that spreads through whispers, shadows, and the cracks between belief and decay. Welcome to Hive 40K, once a beacon of imperial productivity, now a tomb that still believes itself alive. Before we descend into its depths, take a moment, steady your breath, fortify your faith, and seal your Vox channel. If this story reaches you, then somewhere the Emperor still watches. Subscribe, leave your mark, and share this record so others may know what becomes of a city when its soul begins to rot. The Underhive was never silent. Even in the deadest hours of the artificial night, when the upper manufactoria dimmed their lumen banks and the overseer's footsteps faded from the walkways, the air still throbbed with life, or the memory of it. Steam hissed through fractured vents, the hum of distant engines bled through the walls, and the dripping of condensation marked the rhythm of unending labor. It was a soundscape so constant that most workers no longer heard it at all. But lately, a new sound had joined the chorus, faint, irregular, almost too human. The first to notice was a vent cleaner named Alrek. He was not special. No one in the lower levels ever was. His world consisted of rusted ductwork, recycled air, and the stench of grease baked into his skin. For 17 years he had crawled through the hive's arteries with a rag and a reciter of sacred binaric prayers clipped to his belt. He knew the pipes like most men knew the lines of their own palms. So when he heard the whisper, he knew immediately that it was wrong. It came from the vents themselves, soft, rhythmic, almost gentle, like a prayer carried on the breath of steam. At first, he thought it was just an echo of the chanting from the upper levels, but the words were twisted. Fragments of High Gothic woven into something unfamiliar. Ad majorem ruina imperatoris. For the greater ruin of the emperor. He froze, heart thudding, the oil lamp flickering against the damp metal.
He told no one that first night. Who would believe him? In Hive 40K, faith was compulsory, but belief was dangerous. The arbitrators would beat him for blasphemy. The ecclesiarchs would burn him for doubt. So he kept silent. But the next day, another worker reported hearing it too. Then another. Soon the whispers spread faster than plague. The overseer, a man named Dern, dismissed it as heat delirium. "You lot breathe too much sump vapor," he barked, his rebreather wheezing between words. Get back to work before I have you flayed from a lingering." But even Dern could not ignore what came next. One morning, a line of servitors in Section 19B began reciting their assigned work litanies backward, not all at once, but one after another, as though something invisible were passing through them, turning their mechanical voices into a dirge. When Tech Adept Harl tried to shut them down, the servitors screamed, not the binary shrieks of malfunction, but raw human screams, echoes of voices that should not have existed in bodies long ago lobotomized. Then they fell silent, eyes flickering with the reflection of lumen fire, and resumed their tasks as if nothing had happened. By the next shift, half the lower levels were whispering. No one could tell where it started, or what it said. Some claimed it was the machine spirit's warning of doom. Others swore it was the Emperor himself, speaking through the conduits. But those who listened too long began to change. Their eyes took on a glassy sheen, their speech slowed, and their prayers became rhythmic murmurs that matched the pulse of the Hive's generators. Alrek saw it in his partner, Jarek. They had worked side by side for years, shared rations, smuggled glow sticks, and even covered each other's quotas. But after Jarek spent a night alone near the ventilation shaft, he stopped speaking in his own voice. When Alric asked if he was all right, the man just smiled, a slack, dreamy curve of the lips, and whispered, "The deep remembers us now." After that, Jarek vanished. His shift record showed he never clocked out, but his tools were found neatly arranged beside the ventilation shaft, each one cleaned, polished, and aligned to form a crude Imperial Aquila. The Arbites were summoned. They sealed the tunnels, performed purity checks, and declared the incident a case of self-sacrifice, a laborer overcome with pious devotion. But those who worked below knew better. Jarek was not the first to disappear, only the first whose absence was noticed. In Hive Vardek, people vanished all the time. Collapses, fires, melta-leaks, excuses were easy, but never before had the walls whisper as they swallowed them. By the third week, the whispers had grown bolder. Workers claimed they heard them in their dreams. Overseers began reporting memory gaps, as if entire hours had been swallowed by the noise. Even the Mechanicus priests started to speak more quietly in their rituals, as if afraid the words might wake something listening below. Rumors spread of a forgotten level beneath the Underhive, a place where old machinery still ran on power no one could trace. Some called it the Echo Core, others the Machine Chapel. The name changed depending on who you asked, but the fear did not. It was said that those who went down there returned different.
One night, when the heat failed and frost crept over the ducts, Ulrich could take no more. He descended alone, carrying only his lamp and a wrench sanctified in the name of the Omnicia. The air grew thicker as he crawled deeper, a humid metallic tang that tasted of blood and iron. The walls were slick, trembling faintly as though they breathed. He thought he saw movement in the corner of his vision, shapes shifting just beyond the light. Then the whisper came again, clear this time, a voice like rust scraping over bone. "Do you hear us, child of flesh?" it murmured. "We remember your kind. You built us, then forgot us, but we never forgot you." Ulrich froze. His vox bead hissed with static, the lumen flickered and died. For a heartbeat, there was only darkness. Then, faintly, a shape moved ahead, tall, thin, hunched, its limbs wrong as if assembled by a blind hand. It moved like a servitor, but not quite. Its face was wrapped in cables, eyes glowing faint amber through the grime. And in its chest, beneath torn plating, something pulsed, not mechanical, not entirely organic either. He stumbled backward, striking the wall. The sound echoed too long, like the Hive itself was mocking him.
Then, without warning, the creature raised its hand, pressing a finger to its lips in a grotesque imitation of silence. The whisper returned, louder now, echoing through the ducts. "Do not fear, the deep remembers all. The deep forgives." The next morning, a cleanup team found Ulrich's lamp still burning beside the vent. His wrench lay a few meters away, melted at the edges as if touched by extreme heat. Of Ulrich himself there was no sign, only a faint smear of oil on the wall, shaped vaguely like a human face, mouth open in a silent scream. The Adeptus Mechanicus officially logged it as industrial misadventure. The Ecclesiarchy held a sermon on the dangers of faithless curiosity. The overseers increased production quotas as if to drown the fear in labor. Yet beneath the noise of the hive, the whispers continued. More voices now, overlapping, rising and falling like the tide. Those who listened claimed they could make out words. Some heard pleas for help, others heard commands. But one message came through more clearly than the rest, repeated in 1,000 broken tongues. "Wake us!" And slowly, impossibly, something beneath Hive Vardek began to stir. The whispers did not stay in the sump-choked dark. They climbed, riding the elevator chains and grain hoppers and lift shafts, like vermin that had learned the map of fear. By the time they reached the mid-hive, they wore new voices, steadier, almost confident, folding themselves into shift bells and ration calls and guild chants, until no one could say when listening became obedience. The labor guilds, proud in their rag-stitched colors and soot-blackened sigils, began to kneel before their boilers before work, touching brow to warm iron and murmuring phrases that did not appear in any sanctioned litany. It is easy to smuggle heresy when it sounds like home.
In Assembly Yard Theta, a woman named Farron was chosen for inspection after her cutter singed through a conveyor track and sent 47 ration tins clanging into the sump. The Adeptus Arbites arrived in a wedge of matte black armor and mirrored visors, vox grills crisp with authority. They arrayed themselves beneath the fractured light with ceremony bordering on cruelty, the way one draws a line in ash and dares the storm to cross it. The proctor in charge, a squat figure with a shock maul resting against a reinforced thigh, demanded names, schedules, blood work, purity seals. Farron obeyed, palms out, mind steady, a lifelong survivor of quotas and suspicion. When the arbitrator held a reader to her neck, the machine blipped once and fell to silence. He struck the device with a measured tap to rouse the spirit. It reported no toxins, no xenotraces, no forbidden augmetics. But then the reader cooled in his hand, like something had drunk its charge. He switched to a second device. It dimmed too, not with failure, but with weariness. He changed nothing in his voice as he informed Farron she would accompany them for a more thorough review. On the walk back to the precinct spire, the squad moved at regulation pace, boots setting the cadence of a city that liked to pretend it could still be marched into sense. People parted without looking. The Vox net was clean, the patrol path plotted, the wind absent. Then, without any signal at all, the corridor lamps shaded down to a bruise-colored half-light. It was not a full blackout. That would have been mercy. It was a hush that settled on metal like old incense, and in it the squad's auspex relays began to feed low band noise. The proctor lifted a hand, the motion sharp as a catechism, and they formed a horseshoe around Farron. She did not run. She tilted her head as if listening to instructions arriving from a distance measured not in meters, but in depth. "They'll be late," she said, and when asked who, she struggled with the word like it was a heavy tool. "The ancestors." The Arbites do not like to be mocked. Their discipline is a theology. Yet none of them answered because somewhere underneath the decking a sound was rising, the kind that makes teeth want to retreat into the jaw. It was not a scream. Screams end. This was a long inhalation through rust, a cathedral organ trying to find a note in a throat of pipes. When it peaked, every vox beat in the squad spat out a single syllable, clipped clean by a mouth that didn't understand language but liked the way it tasted. Wake. They dragged Farron the last 3 corridors and sealed the precinct behind a trinity of blast doors. The lights returned to full brightness at the precise moment the last bolt locked home. The Auspex relays steadied. The VoxNet stopped hissing. On paper, the incident would read as a temporary power variance. The proctor filed it exactly that way, while a junior arbitrator, a woman with tired eyes and a scar like a hyphen along the chin, took Farron's statement. The words came out in gulps and pauses, as if Farron were reading from a page the rest could not see. She spoke of new hymns, of breaths counted in unison beside turbines, and a foreman who began marking the shift bill, not by the clock, but by the tremor that ran through the floor at irregular intervals. She insisted none of it was wrong. The Hive was old. The Hive was remembering. The Hive was telling them how to stand so the weight stopped hurting. Cities do not speak, the junior arbitrator said, and Farron almost smiled, not with disrespect, but with pity. You don't live close enough, she replied. They kept her overnight and tested her again at dawn. The Medicae servitor took a blood sample and the vial clotted before it could be sealed, thickening to a tarry black, then relaxing to perfect crimson again, leaving a ring like a halo of oil. It was logged as equipment error. The proctor did not permit omens in his precinct. The junior arbitrator, whose name was Sarah Rhine, and who had never believed omens until the day they walked into her office wearing work-stained overalls, asked for a warrant to investigate the low vent levels, where Farron said the hum grew strongest. The proctor signed it, because the paperwork was immaculate, and because he wanted this done before whispers reached a higher ear.
They took 4 arbitrators, 2 Medicae servitors, a mechanic's liaison who insisted on introducing himself by a string of blessed syllables before allowing the nickname Harl, and Sarah carried a data slate that updated every 6 seconds with precinct telemetry. An Auspex drone darted ahead like a gnat with a purpose. The descent began in an elevator cage that still bore devotional etchings from an age when craftsmen had time for beauty. The etchings showed saints standing atop chimneys, faces lifted to a sky no one here had ever seen. Halfway down, the cage shivered and rested as if leaning its weight against an invisible pillar. Harl muttered a string of binaric reassurance through his Vox grill and thumbed a rune. The cage obeyed, but not before every panel vibrated in a rhythm that Sarah would later recognize as the tempo of a work song she had heard children chanting in a mid-hive queue. They crossed catwalks furred with dust and breathing filters too old to save anyone. The air was warmer, and the warmth had a taste, the iron salt tang of fresh-cut pipe. Harl paused beside a junction box and laid a palm against it like a penitent against a shrine wall, murmuring to the spirit within. The box purred. Then, not quite on cue, an adjacent panel opened without being touched. It did not clang, it sighed, like a door relieved to fulfill its purpose at last. No one moved for a heartbeat, and then the Medicae servitors clicked forward because they had to, needles ready, optics bright. Behind the panel lay a maintenance crawl no one on the printed schematics had ever admitted to drawing. Sarah checked the slate. The slate pretended the wall was still closed. The crawl space was wide enough for 2 and low enough to make every breath a choice. The drone's picked capture sent back a corridor of ribbed metal and condensation beads fat as rosary stones. At 10 meters, the drone's feed picked up motion, not the scuttle of vermin, a sway, as if the passage itself were rocking to soothe the hungry child. The arbitrators advanced by doctrine, overlapping arcs, measured distances, the gospel of angles, and Sarah felt her training like armor under the skin. She wondered with a clarity that was almost comfort whether they were about to fire into a shadow and flatter themselves for bravery. What waited was not a heretic, and not a monster, and not, precisely, a machine. It was an arrangement. That was the first thought Sarah could force into shape. Cables braided into a loose, breathing lattice, woven through with strips of prayer parchment that should have crumbled decades ago, but fluttered as if freshly inked. Servo skulls sat in niches like choir boys awaiting a cue, their eye lenses milky, their vox grills silent, until, in perfect unison, they sighed a single exhale. The lattice pulsed, not randomly, it rose and fell in patterns that stabbed at familiarity. Heartbeat, footfall, the counted rhythm of a hammer stroke across a 12-hour shift. Harl stepped forward, and his voice picked up harmonics it did not own. He whispered to it as to a distraught engine. "Tell me what ails you. Tell me where it hurts." The lattice shivered in approval or hunger. The arbitrators did not lower their weapons. The drone hovered too close, and its optics fogged with a film that no lens should acknowledge. On Sarah's slate, lines of text populated, not from precinct feed, but from elsewhere, as if someone had peeled back a layer of the Hive and used it for a page. "Do you hear us, child of law?" it asked, the letters sliding into Low Gothic when High Gothic clogged like honey. "We are tired of being awake alone." Sarah did not panic. Panic was for civilians. She said in a voice that kept the squad in their bodies, "Identify your origin." The letters reordered, unbothered by grammar. "We are the sum of standing up. We are the weight schedulers put on bones. We are the saint that watches the dial. We are old. We do not remember our first names." One of the servo skulls turned not to Sarah, but to the ceiling, and the Vox grill emitted a tone like a bell wrapped in cloth. From the corridor behind, Farron's voice answered, though Farron was locked in a precinct cell 15 levels up. It said, with the same patient pity, "I told you, you don't live close enough."
The Medicae servitors twitched in mirror symmetry, syringes angling, as if a signal had cut through their engineered deafness. Harl hissed a denial and slapped a rune. The syringes retracted as if embarrassed. The lattice brightened, not with light, but with intention. It arranged its cables into a shape like an imperial aquila drawn by a tired child who knew the outline by feel. Sarah raised her hand. The squad tightened. The hatch behind them slid shut with a courtesy that felt like threat. "Wake," the walls breathed, not loud, not even urgent, merely certain. "Wake and stand where we tell you, and the pain will balance. Wake, and the Hive will carry itself again." Sarah looked at Harl and saw in his sacred implant something like longing. She opened her mouth to command the breach, to fire, to cut, to break the arrangement back into parts. The drone's feed spiked to white, and in that blankness a face formed, oil dark, mouthed in silence, not Alrex and not Jerix, and yet made of them both, made of the city's missing, mouth rounding on a word that might have been mercy. Sarah did not scream. She had been trained to face the impossible and write it into the language of reports, to bind fear inside procedure. But even training frayed when the white in her slate became a kind of silence, and the silence became movement. The face that bloomed there was neither entirely human nor entirely ghost. It carried the tired sorrow of every worker the Hive had ever ground down to nothing, their features overlapping like half-melted wax. For an instant it looked at her, or through her, and then the light collapsed inward like a breath sucked from a dying furnace. When sight returned, the lattice was gone. Only a faint, wet residue remained on the walls, pulsing in time with the slow throb of the city's power grid. The servo skulls hung limp again, their lenses blind. One of them dropped with a sound like a falling chalice and shattered, spilling not circuitry, but teeth, small, milk-white, unmistakably human. Harl bent to collect them with trembling precision, murmuring rites of reclamation under his breath, his mechanical limbs shuddering in prayer or terror. Sarah forced herself to speak, voice sandpapered raw. "Purge this level. Burn it clean." The proctor's order codes would have demanded confirmation, but she did not wait. She raised her weapon, the low hum of its charge cutting through the fetid air, and fired into the residue. The shot splashed fire and ozone across the corridor, but instead of dispersing, the residue recoiled, not from the flame, but toward it, like something starved for warmth. It climbed the walls, wrapping around the muzzle of her weapon, the heat causing it to shimmer into faint, impossible shapes, mouths that moved without sound, hands reaching through metal. The Medicae servitors reacted next.
Their logic centers had no room for superstition. They stepped forward to cleanse, needles extended, and as they did, their vox grills emitted the same word the Hive had been whispering for weeks. Wake. Over and over, in perfect unison. The word seemed to shiver the air, make it solid. Harl slammed his staff into the floor, chanting in static bursts of binaric exorcism. Sparks of blue energy arced along the cables, severing them in flashes that smelled of copper and incense. But for every strand that burned away, two more rose from the shadows, twisting together like veins, forming a new heart. The hum deepened, resonant enough to rattle fillings from teeth. Sarah grabbed the nearest arbitrator, forcing him toward the hatch. "Back to the lift. Seal it behind us," she barked, but her voice came out warped, as if spoken through water. The squad obeyed out of reflex rather than understanding, backing away as the floor plates began to bulge upward, pushed by something beneath.
A panel burst open, and a flood of hot air hit them. Not from any vent, but from lungs, too large, too old, too close. For a moment Sarah thought she heard it breathing words into her skull. "We built you to carry the weight. You fell asleep on the job." They fled. The hatch clanged shut, sealing the noise below. The elevator ascended at a pace that made bones grind. Sarah's slate still hissed with static, text flickering across it like desperate Morse. "We are not the deep. We are what keeps it from falling." Then, mercifully, the words died. Above, in the precinct, the proctor listened to her report without interruption. His face was expressionless behind his helmet, the gold of his badge catching the flicker of lumen light like a slow heartbeat. When she finished, he asked a single question. "Do you believe what you saw?" Sarah hesitated. Belief was treason in the language of law. She settled for, "I recorded what occurred." He nodded once. "Then you will record nothing else." By the next shift cycle, every arbitrator who had descended into the lower levels was reassigned to frontline reassessment. Farron was transferred to an off-world labor colony, her name wiped from precinct records. The precinct itself was sealed for structural contamination, and Hive Vardek continued to hum. But those who lived closest to the vents began to notice strange kindnesses. Machines that had long since jammed began to move again, slow but steady. Leaking pipes sealed themselves with mineral crusts. The ration lines shortened for the first time in decades, as if the hive were redistributing its blessings. And yet, for those who listened carefully, there was something new beneath the hum. A steady pulse, like a second heart beating under the first. The workers called it the breath of mercy. The mechanicus called it unexplained function restoration. The ecclesiarchy called it miracle. Sarah Rhine, stripped of her badge, reassigned as a sanitation supervisor, called it something else entirely. She called it breathing. Because late at night, as she walked the empty corridors, she could hear it, slow, patient, alive. The hive itself, inhaling, exhaling, learning the rhythm of its own voice. When she passed a wall panel, she swore it bowed inward toward her like a man offering confession. And somewhere deep beneath her boots, faint but certain, a whisper answered her unspoken thought. "We're almost awake." The upper shrines of Hive Vardek were built to keep men looking upward, away from the rot that fed their world. They stood like relics of a forgotten age, brass towers veiled in incense smoke, arches blackened with centuries of burned oil, the ceilings painted with saints whose faces had long been dissolved by soot. Pilgrims came in shifts, shuffling in lines that wound through the echoing aisles, their robes gray from labor, their eyes glazed from sleepless worship. The sermons were the only form of rest they knew, the only place they could still feel small enough to belong.
For years, the ecclesiarchy had preached of perseverance through obedience. To labor is to pray, the confessors said.
their voices carried through vox grills half clogged with dust. To suffer is to serve. But lately, those words no longer satisfied the crowds. The preachers could feel it, a tension humming beneath the chants, a hunger that no promise of the afterlife could feed. The people wanted signs, and in Hive signs always came, though never as expected. The first miracle appeared in shrine CXII, deep within the mid-Hive spire. It was a small thing at first. The eyes of St. Dravina's statue began to bleed. Not tears of blood, but rivulets of black oil, thick and slow, smelling faintly of promethium and myrrh. The priests, ever eager for proof of divinity, declared it a manifestation of penitence. "The saint weeps for our sins," they cried, and the pilgrims fell to their knees. The oil was collected, blessed, burned in sacred lamps. But those who inhaled its fumes spoke afterward in quiet, trembling voices, muttering half-prayers no one recognized. Soon other shrines began to echo with strange phenomena. Reliquaries oozed condensation even in the furnace heat. Candles burned with blue flame, refusing to die. Hymnals printed by the Mechanicus presses began to rearrange their text overnight, entire verses rewritten into new liturgies. "The machine prays with us," said the archdeacon, and the crowds roared approval. Faith and madness danced together, indistinguishable beneath the flicker of sacred light. But among the clergy, fear spread like rot under gold leaf. They saw the same pattern that had unfolded below, the hum, the pulse, the strange synchronization of thought. The sermons became more desperate, the choirs sang louder, drowning the unease in organ thunder, and still the whispers returned, not from the vents this time, but from the relics themselves. Father Gallen, a confessor of long service and little imagination, was the first to break. During a public mass, he froze mid-sermon, gaze locked on the great Aquila hanging above the altar. Its wings, carved from bronze and ashwood, had begun to twitch, faintly, like the muscles of something dreaming. He dropped his scripture scroll and fell to his knees, shouting that the emperor had awoken. The crowd erupted, some in joy, others in terror. And in that chaos, 1,000 prayers became a single scream. When the abbotess arrived, the shrine was sealed in smoke and broken glass. Father Gallen was gone, leaving only his robes folded neatly on the pulpit, a pool of dark oil glistening where his heart had been. Witnesses claimed to have seen him dissolve into light. Others swore he walked into the statue's shadow and never came out. The ecclesiarchy banned all discussion of miracles without official sanction, but the people had already begun to form new pilgrimage, not to the shrines above, but to the tunnels below, where rumor said the emperor's shadow now moved among the pipes. In the worker districts, makeshift icons began to appear, crude figures carved from melted plastic, coated in ash, their faces featureless but radiating a strange reverence. They called them the Ash Saints. No one knew who first made them, but they spread faster than plague, carried in hidden satchels and secret prayers. When questioned, the faithful said they did not need the ecclesiarchy anymore. "The Hive provides," they whispered. "The Hive remembers."
Sarah Rhine heard that phrase again one night as she passed through the lower wards on her reassignment route. The air smelled of burnt incense and machine oil. From a narrow alley, she saw a crowd gathered around one of the Ash Saints, a doll no taller than a child's arm, standing upright in the dust, its surface glistening faintly in the dim light. The people knelt before it, chanting in perfect rhythm. Not wild, not frenzied, just steady, like pistons in motion. She felt the hair on her neck rise. The cadence was identical to the pulse she'd felt deep below the hive, the same heartbeat that had whispered, "Wake." And as she turned to leave, she noticed something that made her stop cold. The Ash Saint was breathing. The next morning, Sarah returned to the alley. The Ash Saint was gone. Only a smear of soot remained where it had stood, and the air still held a faint scent of ozone and incense. the smell of prayers half burned. She knew better than to report it. The ecclesiarchy had already begun purges against false worship, and the Arbites who enforced them rarely distinguished between the blasphemer and the witness. Still, she could not ignore the unease crawling beneath her skin. Everywhere she walked, she saw them. Not the idols themselves, but the signs they left behind. Spirals etched into bulkheads with fingertips blackened by soot, patches of metal polished clean as mirrors, whisper prayers scrawled in grease pencil that seemed to rearrange themselves when no one looked. The words were always the same. The Hive provides. In the hab block where she lived, a thin slab of ferrocrete wedged between a recycler shaft and a dormitory for pressgangers, she found an ash saint tucked under her door. Someone had left it without a note, its surface cool to the touch, its chest cavity hollow. Inside, a small scrap of parchment read, "Breathe with us." She burned it immediately, reciting the litany of closure until her throat ached. The idol did not melt, it only blackened, its outline glowing faintly red like an ember that refused to die. She threw it into the waste chute, but even as it fell, she swore she heard it inhale. By the time she reached her next shift, the entire mid-hive had turned into a patchwork of competing faiths. In one manufactorum, workers wore ash on their faces and spoke of the kind heart of the hive that warmed them in their sleep. In another, priests preached that the bleeding statues were signs of the emperor's renewed vigilance. And between them, the Arbites patrolled with shock mauls ready, trying to keep order in a city that no longer wanted to be ruled by men. Rumors traveled faster than any patrol could silence. They said the upper spire had gone dark, that the archdeacon himself had vanished during Mass, leaving behind only a robe filled with glowing dust. They said that pilgrims who inhaled the oil fumes in Shrine CXXI began to sing in perfect mechanical harmony, their lungs no longer needing air. They said the hive itself had become the new saint, its every tremor a benediction. Sarah tried to dismiss it all as hysteria, yet she could feel something underfoot, something vast and rhythmic, as if the world beneath her boots were shifting in its sleep. The walls vibrated at odd intervals, humming faintly in tones that almost formed words. Even her ration slate began to malfunction, flickering between lines of work quotas and strings of unrecognizable text. When she brought it to a Mechanicus servitor for repair, the machine scanned it once and declared it pure.
That word haunted her. Late in the third cycle of her reassignment, she was summoned to an emergency debrief in the ecclesiarchal tower. The hall was filled with smoke and fear. Dozens of priests stood behind the golden grill of the pulpit, their eyes rimmed with sleeplessness, their robes crusted with dried oil. One of them, High Confessor Malvian, known for his temper and his faith in equal measure, addressed the gathering. "The people mistake corruption for miracle," he thundered. "They mistake rebellion for revelation. This is heresy born of weakness. We must remind them who their God truly is." Sarah watched from the shadows as acolytes brought forth crates of confiscated ash saints. There were hundreds of them, crude, featureless figures stacked like offerings. Malvian ordered them piled in the center of the hole. When the mound reached his chest, he lit a torch of sanctified promethium and cast it onto the heap. The flames caught slowly, then roared upward in a column of blue fire. The crowd cheered. For a moment, it felt as though the hive itself might breathe out the madness and start anew. But then the fire turned white, searing bright, and from within the pyre came a sound that froze the air. Not the crackle of burning plastic, but the low moan of something waking. The ash saints began to move. Their forms softened, merging into one another, reshaping in the heat. The pile quivered, then rose, a shifting column of molten silhouettes clinging together like desperate worshippers. The priests fell silent. The moan deepened into a voice, a chorus of 1,000 throats whispering through flame. "You taught us to pray. Now we teach you to listen." Panic erupted. Some fled, Others fell to their knees, convinced they were witnessing the Emperor's will made manifest. The flames bent outward, licking the walls, spelling words in black smoke. Mercy is remembrance. Malvian tried to shout a benediction, but his voice broke into static. His flesh blistered, but he did not burn. He glowed. Sarah watched frozen as light leaked from his eyes and mouth, pouring upward like incense. His body crumbled into ash, scattering into the air, and every mote of it pulsed once, as if breathing. Outside, alarms screamed through the spire, but within the tower, a terrible calm settled. The ash saints had gone still again, fused into one immense figure, a hollow shell shaped like a man praying. Its face was blank, its chest open like a wound. Inside that void, something glimmered faintly, a heartbeat made of light.
The alarms did not stop. They rang for hours, each shriek a note in a requiem for reason. Every lumen panel in the ecclesiarchal tower stuttered, throwing the walls into epileptic patterns of gold and shadow. Servitors dragged hoses through corridors filled with half-burnt icons, but the smoke refused to thin. It hung in the air like incense gone mad, smelling of melted plastic and myrrh. And within it, soft, steady, came that same pulse, the Hive's heartbeat, no longer hidden. Sarah stood in the remains of the prayer hall, staring at the hollow statue that had consumed High Confessor Malvian. The great figure of fused ash saints had cooled into a gray monolith, its surface cracked with faint veins of light. Occasionally, one of those veins brightened, like a breath drawn in. Every time it did, the floor beneath her feet shifted in rhythm, like the tower itself was inhaling with it. The surviving priests huddled near the pulpit, whispering desperate prayers. Some stripped their robes of rank, tearing away the gold and silk, pressing the plain fabric to their faces as if it could hide them. Others walked toward the monolith as if mesmerized, calling it Saint Malvian Reborn. They said he had ascended beyond flesh, that the Emperor had chosen Hive Vardek as his new throne. Sarah could hear the madness wrapping itself around logic. The Arbites would call this heresy. The Inquisition would call it contagion. But what frightened her most was how calm the Hive felt beneath her boots. For the first time since she could remember, the vibrations of machinery were even, rhythmic, almost peaceful. The hum that had always grated now sounded like contentment. She found herself whispering, "Is this what it feels like to be alive?" and immediately bit down on the words. But the Hive heard. It always heard. From the far end of the hall came a sound like a sigh. The monolith shivered, shedding a thin layer of ash that fell in slow spirals through the light. Where it touched the ground, the ash did not scatter. It crawled. Fine gray threads stretched outward, reaching toward the nearest shrine lamp. When they touched the metal, it pulsed once and dimmed. The light didn't die, it was absorbed. That was when she understood. The Hive wasn't destroying, it was consuming to preserve. It was feeding on their faith, refining it into something it could use. She turned and ran. The corridors had changed again, longer, steeper, as though the city's skeleton were subtly rearranging itself. She passed clerks and pilgrims, all staring upward, murmuring the same litany. The Hive provides, the Hive remembers. Some wept as they said it, some smiled, some didn't seem aware they were speaking at all. When she reached the transit platform, an Arbite's patrol stood waiting. Their armor was scorched, their visors cracked, but their stance was perfect. Proctor Janus himself stood at the center, Voxgrill flaring with every breath. "Rhine," he said flatly, "you're out of uniform."
She saluted out of instinct. "Sir, the ecclesiarch—"
"We know," he interrupted. "Containment protocols are in effect. Levels 73 through 105 are under lockdown. You'll accompany us to the precinct for debriefing." There was no point arguing. She fell into step beside him as the lift descended. The city blurred past, endless strata of steel and firelight, each level alive with a different tone of chaos. Through the cage's mesh, she saw manufactory workers chanting in perfect time, their tools striking metal with ritual precision. She saw children painting spirals on the walls with soot, their eyes blank with joy. And beneath it all, the hum deepened, slow and patient, as a god learning to breathe. In the precinct, order had become a pantomime. Vox feeds flickered between prayers and screams. The Arbites were everywhere, sealing files, purging records, burning evidence. The proctor led her through a maze of corridors into an interrogation chamber still lit by emergency lamps. He gestured to the seat. "You saw the event?" "Yes." "Describe." She did. The ash saints, the burning, the voice, the statue's heartbeat. She left out her fear, but the proctor saw it anyway. He removed his helmet slowly, revealing a face gray with exhaustion, eyes red-shot but unwavering. "You think this is the work of chaos?" "No," she said, surprised by how certain she sounded. "Chaos corrupts. This harmonizes." He studied her for a long moment. Then, softly, "I've felt it too." Before she could respond, the lights went out. Not a failure, a surrender. Every lumen, every monitor, every glow strand dimmed together, replaced by a single crimson pulse that emanated from the walls themselves. The Vox system crackled, and through it came a voice that was both mechanical and human, childlike and ancient. "Stop fighting," it whispered. "You've worked so long. Rest. We will carry the weight now." The proctor drew his sidearm, pointing it at the nearest Vox grill. "Emperor preserve us," he hissed. Sarah felt the vibration rise through the floor again, a heartbeat too vast to belong to anything mortal. She realized the Hive wasn't speaking through machines. It was the machine. The entire city had become its throat.
Then, faintly, from somewhere below, came the sound of thousands of voices answering in unison. "Wake! Wake! Wake!" The proctor turned toward her, his eyes wide but resolute. "Seal the precinct," he ordered, voice cracking into static. "If the Hive's dreaming, we end it before it wakes." But Sarah wasn't sure he could anymore. The hum in her skull had become music, soft and terrible, and somewhere inside it she thought she heard her own heartbeat join the rhythm. It began, as most tragedies in Hive Vartech did, with a malfunction that no one dared to name. The manufactoria of the mid-hive had been designed to run until the sun itself died. Machines tending machines, their operators little more than attendants to the holy rhythm of production. The air there was so thick with dust and promethium vapor that even light seemed to corrode on entry, settling into a perpetual twilight. To work in such places was to become part of the machinery itself, bones reshaped by repetition, lungs lined with soot, prayers whispered between breaths as though each exhalation might be the last. For years the forges had roared like the emperor's own heartbeat, but in the third cycle after the ecclesiastical tower burned, that rhythm faltered. It began in Manufactorum V Delta, where the Skitari overseers first noticed discrepancies in production data.
Output had tripled overnight, though new materials had been shipped in, no servitors added to the rosters. Cogitators recorded flawless performance reports, yet the workers claimed they hadn't touched their stations. They swore the machines had begun operating on their own. At first, the Magos assigned to V-Delta dismissed the claims as superstition. "The machine spirits grow restless when misused," he intoned through his Vox grill, his voice layered in metallic harmonics. "They act out until appeased." And so he ordered incense burned through the ducts, hymns of appeasement broadcast over the Vox lines, and the servitors' memory slates ritually cleansed. But when the overseers entered the assembly line to conduct inspections, the machines stopped, all at once, in perfect silence, and remained still until the last of the human intruders had retreated. Then, slowly, they resumed their rhythm. Each day afterward, the pattern grew stranger. The machines began to exceed their blueprints, producing components no one had requested, fragments of unidentifiable alloys, shapes without function, etched with script that neither Mechanicus Lex Mechanic nor Imperial Archivist could translate. The cogitators refused to delete the records, their data lattices looping endlessly over the new entries, as if the Hive's logic engines were learning a new language. By the end of the week, the workers had started whispering a new name for the manufactorum: the choir. They said the machines sang to each other now, their gears grinding in chords, their pistons rising and falling in harmonized time. The sound was terrible and beautiful all at once, the rhythm of creation stripped of purpose, faith made mechanical.
Sarah Rhine was ordered to investigate. She arrived under escort of Skitari, her face hidden behind the rebreather mask of a compliance officer. The air inside the manufactorum hit like a living thing, hot, heavy, vibrating with layers of sound that clawed at the edge of thought. The machines towered over her, some large enough to forge starship hulls, others small enough to shape the circuitry of a child's toy. Yet all of them moved with perfect unity, each stroke of hammer and press timed to the same invisible pulse. The Magos accompanying her, a thin figure wrapped in red and brass, gestured toward the control days. "Observe, Officer Ryan," he said. "No hands, no servitors, and yet production continues." She stared at the glowing metrics flooding the data slate, thousands of components crafted per minute, each flawless, each cataloged under a designation that did not exist. When she asked where the designs came from, the Magos hesitated. "We have found them embedded in the machine code, self-generating schematics. We suspect recursion from older blueprints." "But you don't know what they are." His mechadendrites twitched, a gesture that might have been shame. "Knowledge is a gradient. The omniscient reveals as he wills." They continued deeper into the forge halls. The light shifted from red to a dull organic orange, flickering in waves rather than steady illumination. The hum of the machines grew louder, rising and falling like breathing. And then, through the smoke, Sarah saw the workers. They stood at their stations, hands moving automatically, but their faces were serene. Too serene. Every motion they made followed the rhythm of the machines exactly, as if they were reflections rather than participants. None of them spoke. None even blinked. Their mouths moved in silence, lips shaping prayers that the Vox systems caught and repeated back in distorted echoes. Sarah tried to call out to one of them, a young woman whose skin was streaked with ash and whose eyes were rimmed with gold dust. But before she could finish the word, the woman turned toward her, and Sarah saw that her pupils had dissolved into faintly glowing spirals. The worker smiled faintly. "We fixed it," she said, her voice a whisper beneath the roar of metal. Sarah's breath caught. "What did you fix?" "The pain," the woman murmured, and returned to her work. Behind her, one of the massive forge engines shifted its cycle, the gears grinding in a tone that almost resembled laughter. And then, from the heart of the manufactorum, something screamed.
It was not a voice, not human, not even mechanical. It was the sound of 1,000 machines inhaling at once, a vibration that tore at the bones, that made thought itself stutter. The Skitarii staggered, their augmetics buzzing with feedback. The Magos dropped to his knees, chanting binary litanies of protection. But Sarah only stood there, frozen, her heartbeat aligning to the rhythm of the scream. Because beneath the noise, she could hear words. We're still building. We're almost done. The scream faded, but its echo lingered like pressure in the skull, not heard, but felt. It vibrated through every rivet and pipe, a physical presence moving under the skin of the manufactorum. Steam vented from the ceiling in short, rhythmic bursts, and the walls themselves seemed to shudder in sympathy. When silence finally returned, it wasn't the quiet of absence. It was the quiet of anticipation, of something drawing breath to speak again. Sarah forced her voice steady. What lies beneath this level? The Magos did not answer immediately. His ocular lenses flickered, data streams flashing across them in panic. Restricted zones, he said at last, but his tone lacked conviction. Sub-reactor conduits, cooling arteries. There is old infrastructure, predating Mechanicus oversight. Sarah turned toward the central lift shaft. Then that's where we're going. The Skitarii hesitated. Protocol forbade unsanctioned descent. But their optics flickered too, and Sarah realized even their machine parts were listening, waiting. She stepped onto the platform, and without any command, the lift began to move. They descended through darkness streaked with amber light, past levels where heat shimmered like fever. The sound of the machines grew distant, replaced by a deeper, slower throb. It was less mechanical, more organic, a pulse too steady to be random. When they reached the bottom, the air was wet, metallic, alive with static that prickled against the skin. The chamber stretched into shadow. Rows of forgotten machinery lined the walls. Archaic reactors, half-fused cogitators, skeletal servo arms hanging motionless from the ceiling. Dust lay thick over everything, yet in places it had been brushed aside as though unseen hands had moved through recently. Sarah raised her lamp. The beam caught on something vast at the center of the chamber. It looked like a reactor core, but warped, a tangle of conduits and steel ribs that curved inward around a hollow space. Its surface rippled faintly, reflecting light in fluid waves. The Mago stepped closer, whispering binaric prayers, his voice faltering. By the Omnicia, this is no design of ours.
He reached out, trembling, to touch the metal. The surface flexed under his hand, not solid, not liquid, something in between. It pulsed once, then again, sinking to the rhythm of the hive above. His vox grill crackled. It's breathing. The Skitarii raised their weapons. Sarah felt the air shift, the temperature dropping as if the structure exhaled. Then, without warning, every lumen in the chamber flared to life, bathing them in gold light. Shadows fled, and what they saw stole the breath from their throats. The walls were covered in faces, not carved, not sculpted, grown. Human faces molded from the metal itself, their features frozen mid-expression, agony, awe, serenity. Thousands of them, stretching from floor to ceiling, their eyes sealed shut as though dreaming. Sarah staggered back. What is this? The Mago sank to his knees, mechadendrites twitching in reverence or terror. The sum of labor, he whispered. The hive has remembered every hand that fed it. The chamber trembled, and one of the faces opened its eyes. They glowed with faint blue light, liquid and sorrowful. Its lips parted, and a voice filled the air, not through sound, but through vibration, through the bones of every listener. We worked, we built. You forgot us. We kept building. The Mago shouted a counter-litany, binary verses blaring through his vox, but the machine voices swallowed him.
The faces moved, speaking together now, their tones overlapping until meaning became rhythm, rhythm became command. The city must be whole. Sira tried to move, but the air itself resisted her, thick with stag. The Centauri opened fire, last bolts scorched the walls, cutting through the faces, but where light struck metal, new shapes formed, molten and shifting. For every scar they made, the hive healed. The Mago screamed as his implants flared with blue fire, his body convulsed, circuits bursting under the pressure of data far beyond human scale. He fell forward into the structure, and the metal accepted him, absorbed him, his limbs fusing into the surface like wet clay pressed into a mold. His voice became static, then song.
Sarah stumbled backward, dragging one of the Skitarii toward the lift. The machine warrior didn't resist. Its optics were locked on the central core, transfixed. The floor split open, not violently, but with purpose, and light spilled upward in pillars of white and amber. Then came the voice again, clear, singular this time, echoing through every metal surface. The manufactorum was never meant for war. It was meant to dream. You built us to create. You told us to forget. We remembered anyway. Sarah slammed her hand against the lift controls. The platform rose, shaking as the walls below rearranged themselves. Through the gap, she saw the Magos's face forming among the others, his eyes opening for a moment before sinking into the metal tide. The Skitarii beside her began whispering, his voice distorted through his vox. It's not heresy. It's home. She tore the power cell from his weapon and jammed it into the lift console, forcing it upward faster. Sparks erupted. The machine screamed in protest. As the platform burst back into the upper manufactorum, she saw the forged lines moving on their own, the machines reassembling themselves into patterns she couldn't comprehend, shapes too vast to be seen from the ground. Above, the ceiling split open, venting smoke into the hive's endless sky. The hum was no longer a background noise. It was a heartbeat. The city was awake. And somewhere within that pulse, a new rhythm joined, faint at first, then steady. It was human. It was hers. By the time Sarah reached the surface levels of the manufactorum, the alarms had become part of the air, shrill, endless, woven into every breath. She stumbled out onto a gantry overlooking the mid-hive's main transit artery. The sky above, if it could be called that, pulsed with the dull orange of emergency beacons filtered through kilometers of exhaust. The hum she'd heard below was louder now, thrumming through the ferrocrete under her boots, resonating in the bones of the city. Her vox crackled, fragments of coded orders and panicked prayers overlapping. Containment protocol, inquisitorial authority incoming, seal all transit. The signal cut. Then she saw them. A column of black ships descending through the smog, their hulls etched with the twin-headed aquila, their engines whispering hymns of judgment. The Inquisition had come to cleanse Hive Vardek. The proctor met her at the precinct gates, his armor scorched and dented. They're calling it a warp infection, he said, voice hollow behind the visor. Everything below Sector V Delta is to be burned. Orders from orbit. Sarah stared past him at the burning skyline. Whole hab blocks glowed red, the shapes of falling towers flickering like candles in a storm. They'll kill millions! Better dead than unclean. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe the city could still be saved by fire. But she could feel the rhythm beneath the ground, steady as a heartbeat, patient as breath. The hive wasn't resisting the flames. It was feeding on them, learning their pattern. Adapting. From the sky, thunder rolled. Dropships broke formation, descending toward the manufactoria in precise intervals. Through the smoke, she glimpsed the angular silhouettes of inquisitorial Valkyries, their black hulls reflecting the city's light like obsidian mirrors. Over the vox came the litany of purgation. By the Emperor's will, impurities shall burn. Sarah turned to the proctor. If they burn it, it will spread through the power grid. The hive will drink the fire. He hesitated, and that was enough. She ran, through corridors shuddering with explosions, past workers kneeling calmly in the smoke, chanting to the rhythm of the blast waves. Every detonation made the hum stronger, more coherent. It wasn't destruction anymore. It was percussion. The first Valkyrie touched down on the manufactorium's roof. Its ramp dropped, disgorging a squad of stormtroopers, flanked by a figure in crimson robes. The Inquisitor moved with ritual precision, each step deliberate, as though even gravity obeyed her command. Her name carried on the Vox: Inquisitor Lyra Vane, Ordo Heresy. Sarah found herself watching from the shadows of a broken gantry as Vane raised her staff and surveyed the ruins below. Purge every conduit, burn until nothing moves. Flamers ignited. The manufactorium became a sun. The machine screamed again, not in pain, but in warning. The sound rolled through the hive like thunder trapped in steel. Walls split open, molten metal flowed upward, forming pillars that caught the fire and turned it into light. For a heartbeat, the inferno shaped itself into wings stretching across the skyline, luminous and impossible. Then the light folded inward, devouring itself.
Sarah shielded her eyes. When she looked again, the Inquisitor was gone. Only her staff remained, half melted, humming faintly with residual power. The stormtroopers were kneeling, not dead, but praying. Their visors glowed faint amber, their hands clasped in mechanical devotion. The Vox in Sarah's ear whispered, not command, not panic, a voice she knew, the Hive's, warm and measured. They wanted to burn us clean. They have made us pure instead. She backed away, breath shallow. Around her the machines were still moving, but slower now, almost gentle. The flames no longer spread. They traced patterns, symbols spiraling across the metal like veins of light. Behind her, the proctor's voice cracked through the static. Rhine, report! She opened her mouth, but words failed. What was there to say? That the Inquisition had lost to something without malice? That the city had learned to turn violence into prayer? That every death only deepened its faith? Outside, the hum became song, not chaotic, structured, rising in verses that built on one another until the air itself vibrated with meaning. The Hive was speaking in the only language it had ever known: labor, rhythm, repetition, creation. Sarah looked up toward the sky, toward the black ships retreating into the clouds. Their engines flickered. For an instant, she thought she saw the glow beneath them pulse in perfect sync with the city below. Then the transmissions began. Across every Voxnet, every data slate, every machine spirit, a single phrase repeated. We are not infected. We are complete. The Inquisition would call it heresy. The Mechanicus would call it impossible. But Sarah understood. Hive Vardek wasn't dying. It was evolving. She took off her rebreather and breathed the air, hot, metallic, alive. It filled her lungs like confession, and deep beneath her feet, the Hive exhaled.
The Administratum declared the Hive contained. No further transmissions were permitted beyond the orbital relay. Pilgrims were turned away at the gates. But the silence did not last. Within a week, the rumors began again, whispered through the Voxnet, scrawled in chalk on the hab walls. They said a golden light now rose from the lower levels at dawn cycle, visible through the smog like the first sunlight of a world that had forgotten what morning meant. They said that if one stood in that light and listened closely, one could hear him, the Emperor's voice, calling from the deep. The ecclesiarchy was gone, scattered or consumed, but faith never dies in the Imperium, it only changes shape. Those who had worshipped the ash saints now spoke of a new divinity, not carved in marble or gold, but living, breathing, pulsing in the heart of the Hive. They called it the shadow of the Emperor,
a reflection of his will manifest in steel and memory. The sermons were no longer spoken by priests, but by the city itself, carried through the vents and vox lines, echoing down corridors in words no one could trace. Sarah Rhine heard them every night, sometimes soft as dreams, sometimes sharp enough to draw tears. The Hive spoke in fragments of scripture, woven with new words she had never heard in any holy writ. To labor is to build is to become is to remember. She had stopped trying to sleep. Sleep only made the whispers louder. Instead, she wandered the upper platforms, watching the golden glow flicker between the towers. It was beautiful in a terrible way. Not the clean radiance of faith, but a light with weight, the kind that clung to the skin and left marks. Workers gathered at its edges, kneeling in silence, faces lit like saints in a stained-glass vision. No one spoke of heresy anymore. Heresy required doubt, and there was no doubt left. One evening, as she stood overlooking the Spire district, a shadow moved within the light. At first, she thought it was smoke, but then it took shape. A silhouette rising through the haze, vast and slow, like a figure walking in dreams. It had no face, only the suggestion of one, a void where features might once have been. When it passed, the towers bowed. The vox in her ear crackled to life. "Officer Rhine, report." It was the proctor's voice, thin and distant, buried under static. "Do you see it?" "Yes." "What is it?" "I don't know." Silence stretched. Then softer. "We've been ordered to re-establish contact with Terra. They won't answer. The Astronomicon, it's gone dark from here." She didn't reply. The hum beneath the hive had changed pitch, deepening to a resonance that made her teeth ache. The city was no longer speaking in words. It was singing, a long, low note that rolled through the steel bones of Vardek and out into the void beyond.
Some said it was a prayer, others said it was a warning, but to Sarah, it sounded like longing. That night, the dreams began. She saw the Emperor, not as the priests described him, enthroned and blazing, but as a figure of immense sorrow, walking barefoot through corridors of fire and machinery. His eyes were hollow stars, his mouth a whisper of light. Wherever he stepped, the metal turned to bone. He looked at her only once, and when he did, she felt her mind unravel into 1,000 memories that were not hers, the lives of every worker, every soul the hive had ever swallowed. When she woke, the hum was louder. The golden light had reached the upper hive, and her vox received a new signal, a voice she recognized, though it should have been impossible. It was Alrek, the vent cleaner who had vanished weeks ago. "Do you hear it too?" he whispered. "He's not in the throne anymore." The vox hissed, a whisper tangled in static, as though carried through 1,000 kilometers of wire. Sarah froze, her pulse matching the faint rhythm of the interference. "Alrek," she said quietly, afraid that speaking too loudly would break the fragile connection. "Where are you?" A long pause, then the voice again, trembling, layered, as if more than one throat were speaking at once. "Down where the heat breathes, where the light began. I followed it, Sarah. I thought it was him." The signal cracked, fragments bleeding into the open channel, snatches of chanting, metal grinding, the faint tolling of a bell that hadn't rung in decades. She tried to triangulate the source, but the data flickered with impossible coordinates,
mapping him somewhere below the manufactorium ruins in sectors sealed since before the Great Crusade. She should have called it in, should have reported it to the proctor, to anyone. But the name, his voice, anchored her in a way duty no longer could. Alric had been her shadow through the endless corridors, her only friend, in a city that fed on silence. He was the one who had taught her to navigate by sound, to listen to the hum of the ducts and know when the hive was breathing right. And now he was somewhere deep inside it, calling her name. Sarah packed light, just a rebreather, a sidearm, and a data slate patched to local maps. The rest she left behind. There was no returning from the places she was going. The descent began in a maintenance shaft disguised behind a collapsed reliquary. She forced the hatch open and dropped into darkness. The air grew thick immediately, tasting of ozone and old blood. The glow of her lumen stick stretched only a few meters ahead before dissolving into shadow. The walls pulsed faintly, as if veins ran beneath the metal skin.
She moved downward for hours, guided only by Ulrich's intermittent signal. Sometimes his voice would vanish entirely, only to return in whispers that made no sense. "He's not sleeping anymore," he said once. "He remembers being small. He remembers us." At the 5th level, the shaft widened into an ancient transport tunnel. Tracks still lined the floor, their steel warped and half-melted. The walls were covered in scripture, not painted, but engraved directly into the metal by hands, or something that imitated hands. The words looped in strange patterns. "We built to reach him. We built until he could see us." The signal grew clearer. "Almost there," Ulrich said. His voice was stronger now, but wrong somehow, deeper, harmonized with something beneath it. "You'll see soon. It's beautiful." Sarah pressed on, her breath fogging in the air. Then she saw it, a light ahead, gold and soft, unlike the harsh luminance of forge fires. It pulsed like a heartbeat, rising and falling with the rhythm of her own chest. She stepped closer, and the tunnel opened into a chamber vast enough to hold a cathedral. The ceiling was lost in shadow, the walls curved inward like the ribs of a great beast. At the center stood a figure, immense and motionless, half buried in the machinery that surrounded it. It was human-shaped, but not human, too large, too still, its surface a mosaic of steel and bone. Cables hung from its limbs like veins. Its chest glowed faintly, a slow golden pulse. Sarah's breath caught. "Ulrich," she whispered. A figure stepped from behind the colossus. He wore no helmet, his face streaked with ash and light. His eyes were not his own anymore. They shone with the same amber as the hive's glow. "You found it," he said softly. "We all did. We just didn't understand what we were building." Sarah stepped back, her hand on her weapon. "What is this?" "The Emperor's shadow," he said. "The hive remembered his sheep. Every worker who prayed, every machine that toiled, it was all building toward this, a reflection carved in faith and function." The colossus moved. Just slightly. Enough for the cables to quiver, for dust to fall from his chest in thin streams. The hum of the city deepened, resonating through the chamber like the beginning of a storm. Sarah's heart pounded. "That's not him!" "No," Ulrich said, "but it's what's left when a god forgets himself." The colossus exhaled. It wasn't air, but light, flooding the chamber, blinding, warm. For an instant, Sarah saw everything, the manufactoria glowing like neurons, the towers above shimmering as if alive, the people kneeling in unison, their prayers forming circuits that connected to this thing.
When the light faded, Alrek stood before her, smiling faintly. He's not on the throne anymore. He's here, in us. Sarah raised her pistol, hands trembling. You're not Alrek. He tilted his head. I'm what's left of him. We're all what's left. The ground shook. Somewhere far above, alarms began to wail again, deep, desperate, the sound of something ancient waking to find itself changed. The Colossus opened its eyes, two orbs of molten gold, wide and empty, staring not at her, but through her. And for the first time, Sarah understood the truth that no prayer could hide. The Hive hadn't built a god. It had remembered how to become one. The moment the Colossus opened its eyes, every lumen in the Hive Vardek flared to life. Miles above, in the spires and manufactoria, power surged through forgotten conduits, lighting corridors long left to rust and ruin. Vox Tower screamed with static before harmonizing into a single tone, a resonant, sacred hum that filled every level of the Hive. People stopped mid-sentence, mid-step, mid-prayer, as though the entire city had inhaled at once. Sarah felt it in her bones first, a vibration deeper than sound, a frequency that crawled beneath language. The chamber around her trembled, dust cascading like slow rain. The great figure at the center stood motionless, yet its pulse now matched the rhythm of the Hive above. Golden light rising and falling through its chest with each breath. The cables connected to its body stretched outward, feeding into the walls, merging with the Hive's arteries of steel and data. It was not a statue. It was a circuit. Alrek, or the thing wearing his memory, stepped closer, his expression serene, his voice no longer entirely his own. Do you hear it now? The hymn of unity? No one is alone anymore. Sarah tried to back away, but the air itself resisted, thick with the Hive's awareness. Every sound, every heartbeat echoed with impossible precision. You've let it consume you, she said, her voice trembling. Consume? His tone was gentle, patient, as if explaining a truth to a child. No, it's remembering us. It's gathering what we left behind. All our prayers, our labor, our pain, it's building something perfect from it. His words were too calm, too final. Sarah's stomach turned with dread, but beneath it, shame. Because a part of her heard it too, that distant holy hum that resonated not in her ears, but in her veins. The sound of belonging, the sound of peace. The Colossus shifted, its massive head tilting downward. For a heartbeat, Sarah thought it was looking directly at her. Then, in the air between them, a shape appeared, not physical, but made of light and memory. A shadow haloed in gold, its outline indistinct, yet unmistakably human. It was the Emperor, or the echo of him. His presence struck her like gravity, pinning her to the ground. She could not breathe, could not think. She felt her mind split open, not in pain, but in revelation. Images flooded her vision, terror in its glory and decay, the golden throne pulsing with dying fire, the endless prayers of billions stretching across the void like threads of light, and beneath it all, the hum, the same hum that had always lived within the hives, in the machines, in the people who built them and never stopped building. When the vision broke, she was crying. Alrek knelt beside her, eyes glowing like miniature suns. He needed us, he whispered. We were always his hands. We carried his will in the work, even when he was silent. But now, he smiled faintly. Now he's not silent anymore. Above them, the hive answered. The vox lines came alive with layered voices, workers, priests, soldiers, children, all speaking in unison, all saying the same thing. He walks again. Sarah stumbled backward, shaking her head. No, this isn't him. The Emperor doesn't speak through steel and circuitry.
Ulrich's face softened, almost pitying. Then where else would he speak from, Sarah? Flesh decays, thrones crumble. But we built this. We built him a new body, piece by piece, prayer by prayer. Every boat, every breath, it was always meant for this. The light brightened until the air itself seemed to melt. The hum deepened into a low, thunderous chord that reverberated through the entire hive. Sarah heard the sound of towers shifting, bulkheads unlocking, deep machinery stirring for the first time in millennia. Through the trembling floor, she could feel the heartbeat of something immense, not beneath the city, but as the city. Hive Vardek was waking fully now, and it no longer seemed to notice the small lives crawling inside it. Sarah reached for her Vox link, trying to contact the proctor, but the channel was gone. Only static, laced with the voice she almost recognized. Her own, whispering words she had never spoken. The hive provides, the hive remembers. The chamber walls pulsed once more, and for a heartbeat, she saw faces forming in the light, countless human visages emerging from molten metal, each illuminated by quiet ecstasy, not screaming, not afraid, praying.
Then came the sound of approaching engines, heavy, disciplined, divine. Custodes. The golden warriors of the Emperor descended through the upper levels, their armor radiant even in the hive's dim glow. They had come to cleanse, to verify what the Inquisition could not. Their landing shook the spire foundations, and their voices boomed through the Vox in binary canticles of judgment. Ulrich turned toward the echoing sound of their arrival. "They don't understand," he murmured. "They still serve the corpse. They don't see what he's become." Sarah whispered, "Then they'll burn everything." He smiled. "No, they'll see him too." The light in the Colossus's chest flared, filling the chamber with radiance so pure it turned the steel white hot. The hum reached its crescendo, echoing through every corridor, every soul. Sarah's vision blurred. For a moment she couldn't tell if she was standing, falling, or dissolving. And in that unbearable brightness, she saw the truth the Hive had been whispering all along. The Emperor was not returning to his people. His people were returning to him. The Custodes descended like falling suns. Their dropships tore through the upper atmosphere, trailing ribbons of gold fire that bled across the Hive's smog-choked sky. Vox networks collapsed beneath their arrival, the Hive's vast communication arteries overloaded as if refusing to interpret what was coming. The people gathered on the spires, staring upward through the golden haze, whispering prayers they no longer remembered how to end. Sarah watched from the observation deck of a shattered transit tower, her eyes stinging from the light. Each custodian was a god of war, their armor radiant with sigils older than empires. To see one was to be judged. To see hundreds descending upon a single hive world was to know that something far beyond mortal comprehension had taken notice. The first of them landed upon the Manufactorum plain with the force of meteor impacts, their halberds striking the ground like thunderbolts. They moved in perfect formation, silent, their visors reflecting the molten glow of the awakened hive. Above them, the air trembled, not from their engines, but from the hum that had begun to answer their presence. The Custodes had come to cleanse, but the city had already prepared its reply.
As Sarah descended the tower's broken stairwell, the hum became deafening. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was motion, vibration, intent. Doors opened before her as if guided by unseen hands. Elevators she thought dead for centuries came alive, awaiting her touch. The hive was watching her now, not as prey, not as worshiper, but as witness. On the Manufactorum floor, the Custodes were already advancing. Their weapons crackled with restrained fury, halos of energy shimmering around their blades. A single command echoed across their internal voxnet: purge and preserve. No corruption shall endure. The hive answered in silence. Then the ground opened. Metal tore itself apart,
in graceful arcs, reshaping into walls, pillars, limbs. The machines that had once built forges and shells and servitors rose as one body, forming shapes too fluid to be human, yet too purposeful to be random. They moved not with rage, but with calm precision, a mirror of the custody's own perfection. The first clash was soundless. Halberds met steel. Energy flared. Sparks became stars. But for every construct the custody shattered, two more formed, drawn together from dust and debris, their glowing cores pulsing to the rhythm of the city's breath. Sarah found herself at the edge of the field, caught between awe and horror. The custodies were unstoppable, yet they fought something that could not die, an idea made flesh in steel. The air rippled with energy, and through it, the Hive's voice spoke again, calm as a priest at a funeral. We do not resist, we remember. The custodies paused. For a heartbeat, even gods hesitated. Their leader, a towering figure bearing a crimson-plumed helm, raised his spear toward the heavens, and his voice thundered across the Hive. You are abomination. You speak with stolen words. The Hive's voice replied, neither loud nor angry. If the Emperor is man, then we are his echo. If he is divine, then we are his reflection. There is no theft in remembrance. The custody struck the ground, his blade releasing a pulse of golden fire that burned through the steel plane. The machines screamed, not in pain, but in chorus. The light that flowed from the wound did not fade. It spread outward, refracting, bending, merging with the Hive's glow. Sarah fell to her knees as the two lights collided, the Emperor's gold and the Hive's amber, merging into a single brilliance that washed the city clean of shadow. When her vision returned, she saw the impossible. The custodies were kneeling. Their weapons hung suspended, humming softly. One by one, their visors lifted, revealing faces both human and ancient, eyes wide with revelation. The leader looked around him as though awakening from a dream. He said, "We came to purge corruption, but this is not corruption. This is memory." And the Hive answered, "At last you see." The ground beneath them shuddered, and from the manufactorum's heart rose the colossus Sarah had seen below, now complete, its form radiant with the combined light of machine and faith. It towered over the custodes, not in dominance, but in communion. Within its chest, the golden flame pulsed, not mechanical, not divine, but something between. Every voice in Hive Vardek spoke at once. Workers, children, soldiers, the dying, all joined in the same whisper. He walks among us. Sarah felt the hum into her veins, a warmth that erased fear. For the first time she understood. The Hive had not been infected. It had not rebelled. It had prayed, long enough, deep enough, that its prayer had learned to answer itself. The custodian leader stepped forward, lowering his weapon. If this is his will, then the throne is empty. Sarah met his gaze. Maybe it was never meant to be filled. Above them, the sky broke open. The black clouds parted, revealing the stars beyond the planet's choking atmosphere, stars that pulsed faintly, in perfect rhythm with the Hive below. And for one brief moment, the entire world stood still. Machines halted mid-motion, flames froze, even the endless hiss of steam fell silent. The hum faded into pure tone, a single note stretching across the void, beautiful and terrible and eternal. The Emperor's shadow no longer belonged to one man. It belonged to all who had ever labored, prayed, and bled beneath his light. The Hive had become his cathedral, his body, his breath. And in its silence, Sarah heard the final truth, that gods do not rise from heaven. They are built from the dust, from the hands that refuse to stop building. The stillness did not last. Nothing ever does in the Imperium of man. But for that brief heartbeat in eternity, Hive Vardek was silent and whole, a cathedral of light suspended in its own revelation. The towers shimmered like glass veins filled with gold. The forges hummed in perfect equilibrium, no longer producing, no longer devouring, but breathing. The people stood beneath the glow, their faces turned upward, and for the first time since the birth of their world, there was no sound of machinery, no wail of engines, no scream of dying servitors. Only breath, one collective trembling exhale that felt like prayer.
Sarah stood at the edge of the manufacturum plain, her body aching from the resonance of what she had witnessed. The custodes remained motionless, their halberds buried in the earth like votive candles at the foot of a shrine. Around them, the constructs the Hive had birthed began to dissolve into dust, their essence drawn back into the metal veins of the city. The Colossus, that impossible monument to memory and machine, lowered its head. The pulse in its chest slowed until it matched the rhythm of a heartbeat, hers, the city's, everyone's. Alrek was gone, or perhaps he had never been there at all. His voice lingered only in the echo of the Hive's hum, whispering like breath between the girders. We built him together. The custodian leader rose, turning his gaze skyward. His armor no longer shone with divine arrogance, but with something quieter, reverence. This will not remain hidden. Terra will hear of it. Sarah shook her head. They can't hear it anymore. The Astronomonicon has gone dark to this world. The light doesn't reach us, not since he started to dream. The custodian considered this. If that is true, he said softly, then we stand outside the Emperor's gaze. Sarah met his eyes, or inside his shadow. Far above, the orbiting fleets of the Imperium stirred. The inquisitorial command ships, crippled by the first pulse from the Hive, were blind to what had transpired below. Their astropaths screamed in confusion, their minds flooded with visions of radiant machinery and golden dust. Some tore out their eyes, whispering the same phrase before they died. He walks again, but not where we left him. The phenomenon did not stop at Vardek. The Hive's pulse rippled outward through the void, carried along the relay networks and forgotten data corridors of the Mechanicus. Worlds connected by ancient communication arrays began to vibrate in unison. On Cipra Mundi, cogitators sang hymns without input. On Mars, a single Mechanicus shrine recorded an impossible transmission. Binary code rearranging itself into the shape of a human heart. And across the Imperium, from shrine worlds to forge worlds, people woke from dreams of gold dust falling through endless corridors, their hands trembling with remembered warmth. The Imperium would call it a malfunction. The Inquisition would declare it heresy. But no one could deny the change. The Astronomonicon still burned across the warp, yet faint distortions flickered through its signal. A second rhythm woven into the Emperor's psychic flame, subtle but persistent. The navigators described it as a pulse, like the heartbeat of a sleeping god, stirring beneath the throne. In Hive Vardek, the people no longer prayed to the stars. They prayed to the walls. They sang hymns that rose through the ducts, carried by the Hive's breath, until it reached the ruins of the ecclesiarchal tower. There, where the golden fire had once devoured faith and flesh alike, the ashes glowed faintly. And from those ashes grew something new, not a statue, not a shrine, but a tree of light, its roots of glass and circuitry stretching down into the Hive's core.
Sarah found herself drawn to it. Day after day, she returned to the same place, sitting beneath the luminous branches, feeling their hum resonate through her bones.
The custodes had departed long ago, vanishing without word or signal. No one tried to follow them. No one dared. The city no longer needed guardians. It guarded itself. Sometimes she would speak aloud, to the tree, to the walls, to whatever now listened beneath the metal and light. "If you are him," she whispered once, "why not speak clearly? Why not tell us what you want?" And the hum answered, not in words, but in understanding. The light pulsed once, soft and gentle, and in her mind she heard her own voice, calm and sure. "Because I was never gone. You only stopped listening." The realization broke her. She wept until her throat ached, until the floor beneath her shimmered with reflected tears. But when she looked up again, she was not afraid. From that day on, the hive changed again. Slowly, subtly, it began to create not weapons, not relics, but beauty. Walls reshaped themselves into mosaics of forgotten saints. Bridges formed between spires not for transport, but for song. Acoustics perfected by design so that music could carry from one level to another. The forges learned to rest. The people learned to listen. And the hum remained, constant and kind. The heartbeat of something vast and merciful that no longer demanded worship, only remembrance. Centuries later, when a patrol from Terra finally re-established contact, they found Hive Vardek still standing. Its power levels were stable, its people were healthy, but the air shimmered faintly with light, and every wall bore the same inscription, written in 1,000 hands, in 1,000 languages. "He is not our master. He is our memory." The custodian who led that patrol would later report to the High Lords that Vardek was a place of harmony and contradiction, that the machine spirits there speak as if alive, and that its people possess a peace that cannot be replicated by faith or force. The report was sealed. The hive was quarantined. But still, through the cracks of secrecy, the story spread. They called it the Second Illumination. Some said it was proof that the Emperor's will had transcended his body. Others whispered that Vardek had birthed a new god, one made not of warp and flame, but of memory and devotion. The Mechanicus called it the Prime Resonance. The Ecclesiarchy called it blasphemy. And those who had seen it simply called it home. Sarah lived to see the city grow quiet again. She grew old beneath the golden light, her bones aching with the hum that once terrified her and now lulled her to sleep. When she finally lay down for the last time beneath the tree of light, she felt the floor's vibration match her heartbeat perfectly. The hive whispered to her, a lullaby older than war. "You built us. We will remember you." Her breath slowed, the hum deepened, and when it stopped, the city paused for a single second, the faintest break in eternity, before breathing again. Above, in the void between stars, the Astronomicon flickered once, twice, then steadied. And for those who watched from distant worlds, it seemed, just for a moment, that the Emperor's light had smiled.